Thanks to my patrons and Nebula for making this video possible. I want to start this video by saying that climate science is really quite a mature science. We've been studying it for decades, if not centuries, and there are many things that we can definitely say about the Earth's climate. A non-exhaustive list would include But imagine you're a student wanting to start a research career in climate science. Maybe you don't need to imagine that. Well, there are a great many unanswered questions that you could investigate. The IPCC defines three broad areas of climate science: learning how the physical Earth system is changing, understanding the impacts that change will have on us and all other living beings, and assessing what we can do to slow or prevent that change. But within each of these research areas, there are so many questions to be answered. So instead of just 3 options, consider doors. 11 doors, each of which could be opened and set you on a research journey. In this video, I'm going to consider those 11 possible doors, which I've taken from a report written for the European Commission by IPCC scientists on gaps in our understanding of climate change. But before I do so, I do just want to point out 2 things. Firstly, this report was written by European scientists for the European Commission, so there is a bias towards topics of particular interest to Europe. That's not to say that these are bad scientists. Everybody has biases. It's just something to be aware of and something I'll try to point out where it becomes particularly relevant. And secondly, whilst these are areas where our understanding of climate change could be improved, that's not to say that we don't have any understanding in these areas. They're already active areas of research. We just like to learn more and shrink our error bars. Okay, on to the first door. Opening the first door reveals fundamental questions about the Earth system and some feedbacks within it. You could study how heat and moisture move from the land and the ocean to the atmosphere and back again. In particular, we can't accurately model how temperatures over the ocean will evolve as the sea warms right now. We'd like to get better at that. Other research questions in this area include improving our understanding of how clouds modify the global climate, making better use of historical measurements of the climate, and improving our predictions of how the interactions between the ocean, the land, and the atmosphere will evolve in a net zero world, which we've never seen before, but hopefully will before too long. But the area I'd like to draw particular attention to is methane. Yes, methane. Don't at me. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas with a short lifespan in the atmosphere, so reducing emissions from it will be a really big deal in the next few decades to reduce the amount of warming we experience. But there's still gaps in our understanding about how we can monitor and quantify emissions of methane and what the natural methane cycle looks like. Perhaps you could help with that. But maybe that's not your style. Maybe you'd be more interested in the second door. Opening that, you'll find questions about how the physical climate system is changing. I've previously made videos on some of the topics in this section. Understanding how the atmospheric circulation will change in a warming world, well, that's covered in a little bit of detail in my video on the jet stream, while the possibility of global tipping points being reached that abruptly change the climate, like the Amazon dying back or permafrost melting, well, that's discussed in some detail in this video. But this is one of those sections where the authors show their European bias, and I'm going to show mine too because I agree with their focus on the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. The AMOC, for short, is the big conveyor belt of water that transports heat in the Atlantic from the tropics towards the pole, and is a vital part of how oxygen and nutrients move around the ocean. We're pretty confident that in the last ice age it collapsed, stopped flowing completely, and this caused temperatures to plummet in the northern hemisphere. It is possible that the AMOC will similarly collapse this century due to rising temperatures and specifically ice in Greenland melting, running off into the ocean. It's one of those possible global tipping points that I mentioned earlier. The IPCC currently estimates that the likelihood of such a collapse is low, but there are large uncertainties. We've observed that parts of the AMOC have definitely slowed down in recent decades, but much more research is needed to find out whether that collapse is going to happen or not. That means better long-term observations are needed, higher resolution computer models, and better representation of the internal workings of the AMOC in those models. There are a few research areas in this report that I personally see as really big deals, and this is one of them. Not just because I live in Europe. Global tipping points need a lot more research. Okay, moving away from the physical climate system, behind door number 3 we have something a little different: climate risks. We know that climate change will increase the likelihood of certain risks like wildfires or disease outbreaks, But there are specific research questions that require more attention, like improving our understanding of how vulnerable different ecosystems and societies are to a changing climate, and how that will change as those societies evolve or develop, improving our assessments of the risks associated with climate mitigation strategies, so for example, how growing biofuels might affect biodiversity, better understanding the risks associated with temporary overshoot warming, so warming greater than 1.5 degrees Celsius that will eventually come back down, and looking through the distant past to see how ecosystems responded to previous large changes in the climate, giving us some kind of idea of what to expect this time. As I've already said, research is already active in all of these areas, but there are two further specific research questions that definitely need more attention. Cascading, compound, and transboundary risks and adaptation, and exploring societal resilience in a volatile world amplified by climate change. As the climate changes, one risk can lead to other risks. For example, an increase in flooding can lead to increases in cross-border migration, which could lead to political instability, and an increase in the spread of waterborne diseases. These second-order impacts are not as well understood as the immediate impact of climate change, and neither is the concept of a polycrisis. This is where lots of stuff goes wrong all at once, sometimes connected, but it doesn't have to be. And we don't know what challenges responding to, say, a new global pandemic at the same time as a global supply chain shortage brought on by climate change might bring. That needs further thought before it happens. There's also an interesting point here about pinch points in the global economy. For example, earlier this year, the Panama Canal was affected by drought, which was exacerbated by climate change, and that reduced the capacity of the Panama Canal in terms of shipping, which had knock-on effects for the global economy. And there are several other pinch points in the global economy that could be affected by climate going forwards, and we don't know what the impact of that might be. 3 doors down, and our next door is our first look at how we adapt to climate change. This is one of the largest sections in the report, so I won't go into any great detail, but there are questions here about what the limits of different adaptation strategies, like changing urban design philosophies, are, how we can improve our modelling of changes to coastlines, improving our attribution studies, saying whether an event happened because of climate change or not, and improving how we build back after a natural disaster more resilient to a changed climate. The thing that stood out to me in this section, though, was nature-based solutions, which the authors of the report say are clearly preferable over grey solutions, without defining what either of those things are. Holly Jean Buck defines natural climate solutions as conservation, restoration, and land management actions that either increase carbon storage or avoid greenhouse gas emissions from ecosystems. Though, as she points out, this book is very good, by the way, you should read it, I'll leave a link in the description, it's more complicated than that implies, and there are large question marks around how effective these strategies actually are, especially in a changing climate. The IPCC authors concur and would like to see more research on the costs and benefits of such nature-based solutions in different settings. Though I should point out that climate change is only one of the reasons we should be doing these things, maybe not even the strongest reason. Door number 5 is a weird door. In constructing this report, the authors grouped together different research questions around a theme, normally a tightly defined theme. Door number 5 is different. Behind door number 5 are questions about water. There's a saying I like in climate circles, which is that water is the middle child of research and policy, because it just gets neglected compared to other topics. Which is kind of crazy when you think about it. We all depend on water, and yet by 2030, freshwater demand is expected to outstrip supply by 40%. And the hydrological cycle is only going to get more disrupted by climate change. At the same time, 10% of the world's population lives in coastal areas that are expected to be inundated or infiltrated by salt water. That's nearly 1 billion people. So perhaps it's not surprising that IPCC authors wanted to see more research done on where water intersects with both nature and society. How will freshwater and marine ecosystems respond to a warmer, more acidic world? How will our strategies for guaranteeing access to water impact the broader hydrological cycle? What on earth is going on with soil moisture? We need better observations and modelling of what's going on there, with massive implications for agriculture. How can we best protect freshwater ecosystems and prevent the 1/3 of all freshwater species threatened with extinction from going extinct? Can we improve our strategies for managing rising sea levels and coastal erosion? And last but not least, how are coastlines around the Arctic going to change as permafrost there melts, potentially releasing a lot of methane? Water is maddening to talk about because these topics are enormous. I could probably make videos about each one, and maybe I should. But for the sake of this video not being gigantic, I am going to move on to the next door. But if you found any of these research points interesting, please read the full report. I'll leave a link to it in the description, and Google key phrases that you find particularly interesting. You'll find some papers to start reading and some scientists to follow. That's how you get started. Okay, door number 6. This is simpler. If you choose to open this door, you'll be researching questions about how emissions, adaptation, and mitigation are connected. Mitigation, just to be absolutely clear, is how we stop making the problem worse, namely by reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases. But in trying to adapt to a warming climate, you might accidentally increase your emissions. For example, you might outfit homes with air conditioning units to deal with higher temperatures, which will increase emissions from electricity generation if you don't shift to renewables. On the flip side, if you try to reduce emissions by making cities denser, thereby reducing the need to travel by car, lowering transport emissions, you could intensify the urban heat island effect, which would then lead to more air conditioning usage and so an increase in emissions as well. To quote the report, research is needed to support a more strategic approach to climate action and sustainable development by providing a more complete overview of how adaptation and mitigation interact with each other and with other policy objectives. So the 3 research questions they specifically raise are: what are the synergies and trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation at different scales? How will low-carbon development evolve as this century goes on? A question I think is particularly cool to think about. And how do we design strategies to reduce emissions that will be resilient to a warmer planet? For example, planting new forests that won't easily fall victim to wildfires. Any one of those could be the subject for a new student's research career. Though I should point out that in any researcher's career, a person will often flit between similar subjects, like subjects behind the same door. But some researchers do like to be more wide-ranging. One technique that can be widely applied, in fact it probably could have been applied to many of the topics we've already discussed, gets its first explicit mention behind door number 7. And that's machine learning. Door number 7 is all about systems and how we can transform them from the bottom up. The first research question is a really important one. How can cities get us to net zero? As no two cities are alike and are highly complex systems, this is an excellent use case for machine learning. Reducing energy demand, minimizing the need for transport and the creation of waste, and even the design of new buildings. Machine learning can be really helpful here. But there are 2 big challenges to overcome to do all that. Firstly, you need to build high-quality data sets of, for example, energy use per building. And secondly, you need algorithms that will give useful, actionable insights to city officials. Something that will take lots of interdisciplinary work to design, but an excellent topic for computer scientists to tackle. The second question is similar but broader. How is digitalization, using computers, changing how we do basically everything? And what are the opportunities for machine learning in combination with digitalization to reduce our environmental impact? But also, what is the expected climate impact of all that new computing power? There's a growth market for research. The third question is about possibly the most important system of all: fossil fuels and their associated infrastructure. How can we reuse the vast infrastructure of coal, oil, and gas extraction and refinement for lower carbon sources of energy? Specifically, they call out hydrogen and synthetic fuels for things like aviation and shipping, but there's also an opportunity for geothermal energy here. See my most recent video for more on that. And lastly, how can we reduce carbon emissions from buildings, both in terms of their construction and their operation? There's lots of questions here about how can we develop new materials and improve recycling of old materials, but also more fundamental things like how do you classify different types of building and build government policy around that information. Okay, we've already gone through a lot. Turns out this is a massive subject to try and summarize, but we're nearly there. Just a couple of doors remain, 2 of which are a little controversial to open. And we'll start with the lesser of those 2 now. Door number 8, land use, agriculture, and carbon dioxide removal.
22% of global emissions come from agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. Part of our strategy to get to net zero, then, should include changing how we use the land, ideally intersecting with policies that also improve food security, biodiversity, and public health.
I see a lot of people online who seem to believe that changing how we use the land, and in particular doing something called regenerative agriculture, is the way we get out of the climate crisis. And no, the data says it's not that simple.
Sure, it's probably part of the solution, but we need to better understand the trade-offs in different land use strategies and how they can be implemented. There's a huge opportunity to suck carbon out of the atmosphere via plants and either restore it to the soil or use it as a resource elsewhere, but that's a complex bio-supply chain that needs to be studied more. There's the almighty question of how can we best grow food for a vast global population and reduce emissions and make that system less susceptible to a changed climate. Something that experts believe is possible, but we need to work out how we'll actually get there in practice. Possibly via the technique known as agroforestry, growing crops and trees together on the same land. But this has only been investigated on small scales. We definitely need to run some more studies here. I'd also like to point out that there's a massive debate to be had about animal agriculture. See another video I made recently for more about that.
And then we come to the controversial topic of carbon dioxide removal. I've already touched in this section on the idea of using plants to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, but there are other techniques that use machinery to pull carbon out of either the atmosphere or the ocean.
The report makes it clear that we need more knowledge about these techniques. Yes, in terms of how can we build them and how effective they are, but also how we use them. How do we include carbon dioxide removal through new forests and through more technological solutions in a broader strategy that doesn't ultimately slow us down getting to net zero? Because the main thing is lowering carbon emissions, and some scientists fear that concentrating on carbon dioxide removal could distract from that goal. But basically every positive trajectory to 2100 considered by scientists has some form of negative emissions, or drawdown. We'd better get a good handle on how we're going to do that, because sooner or later, we will need that knowledge.
We're nearly there. Door number 9 is perhaps the most underlooked research area in this whole report, possibly because of who's been doing the research to date, and almost certainly because of who's been talking about it in the media.
Door number 9 is about equity and just transitions. In other words, how do we get to a low-carbon society in a way that's fair to everyone and doesn't intensify existing inequalities? In fact, is there a way that we could lower emissions and reach other sustainable development goals as defined by the United Nations?
There are 4 research questions here, and I think it is worth looking at them individually.
The first is about how we can improve climate attribution. In other words, figuring out if climate change made an event or a series of knock-on events more likely or even possible. This is relevant because climate change disproportionately affects vulnerable communities, and being able to say that a community is definitely be affected by climate change, such as through a drought, is the first step to that community being supported through climate finance and legal frameworks, which we also need to massively develop. The second question asks, how can we better protect vulnerable communities in adapting to and rebuilding from a changed climate? This one's pretty self-explanatory. How can we plan in a way that doesn't leave any group of people behind? Definitely an area that we need to improve in. The third question asks something similar, but about mitigation rather than adaptation. How can we better represent a just transition in our strategies to lower emissions? And in particular, moving away from just considering dollar values, but all aspects of well-being and the living standards of different communities. And the final question actually shares some DNA with the previous door. How do we accomplish all of the above, but with how we use land? Mitigation and adaptation strategies are normally about energy, but as we've already learned, land use and agriculture are massive contributors to global emissions. So how do we change our land usage in a way that's fair to communities that depend on the land, many of whom are marginalized?
Right, the final big door. For many of you, this will be the most pressing research question. How do we make the changes that we know we need to make to global society faster? Why aren't we doing anything about climate change? This section is titled Accelerating Climate Action, and it identifies 7 possible ways you could contribute to research on this topic. I feel obliged to point out that, as the title implies I guess, People are acting on the science, and we are heading in the right direction, just not fast enough. And if you want to accelerate that action, then activist activity is absolutely going to accomplish that. But what this section asks is, how do we inform that activism to be as targeted and as effective as possible? This is really important research.
The first way you could contribute to this research is finding out how we can better communicate science and improve the climate literacy of audiences.
Wait a minute, that's literally what I do.
I love this quote. Recognizing the power of storytelling to instill agency, research that explore narratives that integrate climate change information into people's lives, focusing on solutions-orientated messaging that people can identify with.
This is precisely what I am trying to accomplish with this channel right now. So it's nice to hear that IPCC scientists agree that this is worth doing.
Secondly, how can we improve our understanding of social dynamics with the goal of finding plausible social tipping points to widespread climate action? However, because this is about social dynamics and I'm a physicist, I'm not qualified to talk about this anymore.
There are also questions about assessing how effective current climate policy actually is and has been. They advocate for using machine learning again here. Assessing how sustainable development has changed in the past and what we can learn from this, and asking how massive global shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine led to responses that lacked any real kind of climate component despite the severity of our situation.
But perhaps the most pressing research question is this one. How do we better mobilize climate finance? As I've talked about in previous videos, most climate solutions actually save money in the long run, even not accounting for the impacts of climate change, but implementing those solutions takes money. How do we free up capital for the clean energy transition? How do we better communicate climate risk to financiers who clearly underestimate such risk at present? And how do we get money to where it's really needed in the global south? And with those small questions, that's door number 10. We're all done, right? Well, not quite. There's still this door, the most controversial and the shortest section of the report. Door number 11 is about climate intervention.
We have been unintentionally modifying the Earth's climate for over 200 years now, increasing the concentration of certain gases in the atmosphere that raise the average temperature. But what about intentionally modifying the climate in the other direction, otherwise known as geoengineering? There are techniques that have been around for a couple of decades now that propose reducing the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface, thereby cooling the planet. These techniques are known as solar radiation management. As I already said, these techniques have been around for a few decades now, but several very large questions remain about them and how we would use them.
The report characterizes the impact of such SRM as very significant, yet still poorly understood. There are huge uncertainties about its possible impacts on agriculture, plant life in general, and precipitation patterns, not to mention the social implications of long-term international collaboration, effective governance, and ethically, deliberately altering the planet. The report summarizes that a more comprehensive understanding of the risks, uncertainties, and limitations associated with geoengineering techniques is essential to facilitate an open and transparent debate that could lead to a global consensus on their use, including development of common rules, and, if deemed appropriate, implementation of moratoria, banning it outright.
This is a controversial idea, and I am not advocating that we should be geoengineering the climate. In fact, I have much more to say about this subject at a future date. But this is an area where ignorance is dangerous, and more research will mean that we can have a more informed debate about these technologies and their use, and whether we should in fact ban them outright.
If you're a student looking to begin a career in climate science, there are so many avenues available to you. This video is quite a bit longer than even I thought it would be. While our breadth of knowledge about climate change is enormous, even in summary filling 3 vast publications, there is still a lot of work to do. And whether you find the physical Earth system, planning for how we adapt to a warming climate, or preventing warming from getting worse more interesting, there's a topic out there for you. Maybe you could contribute to our understanding of and solutions to the most important, most pressing issue we've ever faced.
There are several threads that appeared time and time again in this video. We heard several times about the importance of higher quality measurements to inform computer models, the better representation of reality in those models, and assessing second order or cascading impacts of living on a warmer planet. But something else I hope was apparent was the need for interdisciplinary research, reaching across those boundaries between academic subjects and collaborating with other researchers.
The world can't be looked at through just one lens, and listening to experts from other disciplines can be extremely revealing. For example, while I often talk about solar power, this video from Practical Engineering about the difficulties of connecting utility solar to the grid taught me a lot, as did this video about the Republican Party in America and wind power from Polymatter. A condensed, curated timeline of thoughtful videos seeing the world through different lenses can be found on Nebula, the creator-owned streaming service that I'm part of and have been since the beginning.
If you enjoy content like mine, then there is a vast library of videos, podcasts, and classes available on Nebula, spanning subjects as diverse as film criticism, coding video games, engineering, and climate science. And much of it is available nowhere else. They're Nebula exclusives, with all content available on Nebula before anywhere else.
I have a bunch of exclusive videos on Nebula, including a whole class on how I write videos, but also extended interviews with experts and exclusive video essays like The Antarctic Impossibility of 2002.
Nebula is not trying to replace YouTube. It has an entirely different business model. We're not built on ads, we're built on a subscription model, because we creators don't like writing and running adverts. And your subscription can then be split between the creators that you watch. So with every view of content, you directly support the creator, more so than per view here on YouTube. And if you use my link, that subscription is a little over $2.50 a month, with options for monthly, yearly, and even lifetime membership. Again, that money going to the creators and financing the creation of bigger and better content.
To get access to exclusive content, discover new creators, and directly support me, head to go.nebula.tv/Simon Clark, linked in the description. That link again, go.nebula.tv/Simon Clark.
Thank you for watching. This one was a little experimental. I don't normally do these deep dives on just one document, but let me know what you thought down in the comments. And if you liked this, then definitely go check out Just Have a Think's excellent channel. He does this kind of video more regularly. I'll leave a link in the description. Also linked below is my Patreon. The names on screen right now are my lovely executive producer, Henry Cavill and Steven Spielberg patrons, who get early access to videos, exclusive behind the scenes content. I do a fun monthly vlog, and if they are a producer patron or higher, they get to vote on a video topic a month. If you out there are a patron, thank you so much for completely changing my life and how I'm able to do this job. If you'd like to join them, link down there in the description. That just leaves me to say thank you again so much for watching. If you'd like to watch something else, here's 2 videos I prepared earlier. And if you enjoyed the video, pop it a like, leave a comment. I'll see you in the next one.